This lecture is on the layers of tissue that are found in the wall of the GI tract. So the GI tract, as you know, is a tube, but the point is that it is made up of lots of different layers of tissue. And so I'm going to start with the innermost layer here. So here we have then the major layers of tissue that are found, as I said, in the wall of the GI tract, starting from the inside. So to begin, on the very innermost lining of the GI tract, we have a layer of epithelium. Because of course we do. You remember from ANP1 that epithelial tissue makes linings and coverings. It creates sheets of tissue. It also creates glands. But here we are talking about epithelium creating sheets of tissue that basically line and cover almost everything in the body. So it's not surprising that the innermost layer of the GI tract has a lining of epithelium. So here we have epithelium then. This then has an exposed surface. That is to say, it is exposed to the food on the inside of the tube, also the acids, the bases, the enzymes, and so on. So it has an exposed surface which is bathed, as I just said, in glandular secretions. So it's a tough environment, and it has pleats in it, both for expansion and to increase surface area. Again, because of course it does. Any time that you wind up seeing sort of unnecessary detail that you don't quite understand why there should be quite so much material in a given area or quite so many wrinkles or creases or whatever, the answer usually is that this increases surface area, because it is at surfaces where you have a lot of chemical reactions take place and a lot of exchanges taking place. So as a result, a lot of times in physiology, the reason for folds and the like is going to be to increase surface area. In this case, the surface area, for instance, for absorption. So that's layer one. The next layer then is called the lamina propria. And this contains blood vessels. Again, of course it does. You remember from ANP1, epithelial tissue does not have its own blood supply, but it still needs nutrients, it still needs oxygen supplied by the blood. Where does it get it? From the next layer of tissue over, in this case, the lamina propria. So the lamina propria contains blood vessels. It also contains sensory nerve endings. And lymphatic vessels, and sometimes lymphatic nodules. Next, we have a thin layer of muscle called the muscularis mucosae. And this then is made up of muscle fibers, both circular and longitudinal. What do I mean by both circular and longitudinal muscle fibers? I mean that if you have a tube, here's a tube, circular muscle fibers will go around the tube like that. So circular muscle fibers are actually making up circles, and longitudinal fibers will go along the length of the tube. So we have both circular and longitudinal muscle fibers here. We're still talking about the muscularis mucosae here. So it has the circular and longitudinal muscle fibers. And these then are for mashing food. So this just changes things a little bit, really. So this also goes for changing the shape of the lumen. The lumen is the opening, the actual open part of that tube. The inside part where the food's going through is known as the lumen. Okay, so we have the epithelium and we have the lamina propria. Now, one thing you need to know is that sometimes this, the epithelium, combined with this, the lamina propria, sometimes those two together are known as the mucous membrane, and then sometimes also as the mucosa. You will hear it referred to in that way. Sometimes the muscularis mucosa is also included in this sort of general purpose combined membrane that is known as the mucosa or the mucous membrane. Okay, and this is one of the things that can be confusing, but frankly, don't worry about it, because you will hear different teachers tell you that there are different numbers of layers to the wall of the GI tract. And what's going on here is that some people will combine these thin layers of epithelium and lamina propria, and sometimes also that inner layer of muscle. Sometimes they're just all considered to be one thing that works together, the mucous membrane. Sometimes they're all enumerated separately. Sometimes it's only the first two, the epithelium and the lamina propria. So you will hear different people talking about different numbers of layers to the gastric wall or to the GI tract wall. Don't worry about the number of layers. I'm spelling it all out so that you have all the different components, and they all exist in the GI tract. This is making sense. So anyway, here we have the mucous membrane, and now I'm going to carry on with the rest of the layers. So then we finally get beyond what anybody considers the mucous membrane, and we wind up with the submucous Mucosa, sub because it's underneath. That is to say, in this case, inside of the mucosa. So the submucosa then is made up of loose connective tissue, with blood vessels and lymphatic vessels, and some what are called exocrine glands. Okay, now remember what an exocrine gland is. You should have been told already that there are endocrine glands and there are exocrine glands. Exocrine glands secrete their fluid, their secretion, into a tube, like a garden hose, basically, and that tube then carries the secretion to wherever it's going to go. Whereas with endocrine glands, these are the glands that secrete your hormones. Hormones just enter the bloodstream. They go all over your body. But still, due to some interesting chemistry, they only affect the appropriate target tissues. So in this case, we're talking about some exocrine glands that are found in the submucosa. Now, the submucosa then also has what is called the submucosal plexus. And that is basically various nerve cells. All right, then after the submucosa, now we get into a much larger, more substantial layer of muscle. This now is the muscularis externa. So this is the more external, that is to say, the nearer the outside layer of muscle. This is a much more hefty layer of muscle than what we were talking about before. And again, here we have both circular and longitudinal smooth muscle. You remember smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is the muscle that is capable of long sustained contractions, and it is not under voluntary control. So we have here smooth muscle, and this now is for moving food. And it has nerves for controlling this. You don't have to think about it happening. It just happens. That's the way that smooth muscle works. And so what happens here, the way that this works, is by the process known as peristalsis. So here we have a tube. Now I'm going to slice through that tube. So here is an interior to a tube. here I have a piece of food. The way that this is going to get moved is by having the circular muscles contract. When a circular muscle, such as you might find there, contracts, it's going to pinch the tube, like that. And then, as subsequent fibers of circular muscle contract, then you wind up with the pinch being there and the food being moved on, and then eventually the pinch being here, and the food gets moved on in front, and it just keeps going and going and going. You can just wind up having that pinch carry on, and the food gets moved in front of it. And this process of moving food through a tube in this way is the process that is called peristalsis. That is how food moves through your gut, and that is done by the muscularis externa. And then finally, on the outside, we have the adventitia. And this now is connective tissue. You nearly always have connective tissue because you have to hold things together. So things are nearly always held together in some way or another by connective tissue. So in this case, the adventitia is also sometimes used to simply anchor the GI tract. And then within the peritoneal cavity, that is to say the abdominal cavity, this is covered by a membrane called the serosa. That's an E, the serosa. And that's it for the layers of the GI tract wall.